Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about double stops. So what are double stops to start? Double stops on violin are whenever you play two notes together. So, for example, whenever you play two notes together, that's what a double stop is. And this is not to be confused with chords, which is three or more notes together. Chords are those are chords, and we are not going to be talking about chords today, just double stops. So you hear double stops a lot, and they can be any interval from thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, octaves, any interval. And they're played on two different strings. So let's talk about how do we play double stops first. Or rather, how do we practice double stops? Because, playing double stops can be fairly simple. But how do we practice them and how do we keep them in tune? Because intonation is the really tricky part about this. So for starters, let's talk about the elbow level. Where should your hand be? Where should your elbow be on the left hand? So for starters, every string has a level. So there's 7 total levels, right? G string, D, A, E. Notice how my elbow moves with all of them. So there's 7 total because there's 4 strings and you can have 3 in between. So G, D, D, A, E. So these elbow positions really matter. So for double stops, your elbow position will always be between 2 strings. So for G and D, that, D and A, and then A and E. So that's for your elbow level. And you need to always be conscious about where is your elbow. Because if it's leaning towards one or the other too much, your double stops won't sound even. So now that we've got the basic elbow level down, let's talk about how do we practice that. So for this example, for today's talk, we're just going to be playing pretty much like a C major ascending thirds pattern. This can be found in Don't Etude number 8, but it sounds kind of like this. So let's just talk about how I got there. So first, I'm going to play these as broken thirds. So what that means is instead of playing them as together double stops, I'm going to play them as broken thirds first to tune. Now, when I'm practicing these as broken thirds, I'm not placing the fingers down one at a time though. I'm still placing them as double stops. I'm just playing them separately to hear them. So we start with broken thirds, and then next up we're going to play broken thirds and then the double stop, like so. And you're gonna go really, really slowly, painfully slowly as I'm playing now, and even slower, as long as you get it in tune. This is something that requires extreme patience. If you're gonna speed up at all, those double stops will just not be in tune. So after we spelled the chords out, that's what I'm gonna call it. So broken, and then spelling, now we're going to take this section and we're going to play one line at a time, but in playing the one line at a time, we are still going to have all of our fingers down, like so. So notice my fingers. So what I was doing was I was playing I put both my fingers down. As you just saw, and I was only playing the bottom line. So that's another tip that we'll get into later, but you're going to practice one line at a time, starting with the bass line or the bottom line. And then once you're comfortable with that, you're going to move on to the top line. Same thing here, both my fingers are down, but I'm going to only play the top note, so the top string, basically. Once you're comfortable with that, then you can try to add in you can play both strings at the same time. So before we were splitting up the strings, now we're going to play them together. And we're going to play this very slowly, listening out for intonation. Now, it's totally okay if the thirds that you're practicing or whatever interval you're practicing is not shifting yet. That is totally fine. You're just going to practice exactly as I was doing, just without the shifts. Now, if you are playing something with shifts, here's the next step. Well, actually, this should have come before, but here's another step you should take. I'm going to isolate the shifts. Isolate where I see the shifts in the music, and I'm only going to play those. So for the excerpt that I was just playing, I'm going to only play the shifts, like so. And this is because mostly when we shift, our hand gets messed up and then the intonation just kind of goes whack. Like when you're playing in one position, pretty simple. But when you shift, you have to adjust. So we're only practicing those shifts, but maintaining the same hand frame as we go along. And that is just one line out of an entire page of thirds I just played. So this is extremely slow, excruciating work, but I promise you, if you take these steps very slowly, very patiently, you will get those thirds in tune. You will get those intervals. I keep saying thirds because I'm playing them here, but any interval, this works with any octaves. Let's say octaves. This is the same method. You're going to go the same method, sixth. Same thing. So that's the gist of it. I know I went through this very quickly. I just showed you all the steps, but what you actually have to do is you need to take time between every step. Don't just gloss through it like I did for the video, but really, for example, step 1. I could spend forever on just that. I could spend maybe 10, 15 minutes first, and then I can move on to the next step. It's not simple, like you don't just play it through once. We gotta go really slowly, really carefully listening to that intonation. And so there it is. Those are some ways you can go about practicing these double stops. Now, some tips. You're going to go, number 1, very slowly, tune everything. Here, listen out for that extra ring, because on violin, when things are perfectly in tune, you can hear an extra ring. So I kind of talked about this in my octave video, but when you play an interval in tune, those notes will kind of ring your violin more. So here for that, I don't know how else to describe it, but it's a ring. You'll hear it when you hear it. And my next tip is going to be to focus on the bass line. You can't go wrong here. Whenever you're playing, again, back to my don't 8 excerpt, you're hearing things equally as I'm playing them, but what I'm actually listening for is just the bottom line. I'm just listening out for. Because when you focus on the bottom note, everything else tends to fall into place. And finally, my last tip is to focus on your right hand when things get too much. Because when you're solely focusing on your left hand, you're neglecting that a big part of tone, a big part of how a good double stop can sound is your right hand. Make sure when you're playing double stops that your bow is evenly distributing its weight onto the two strings. So I'm not leaning on my G string, and I'm not leaning on my D string, but I'm playing them very evenly together. And so sometimes when you're practicing these double stops, sometimes you just need to stop thinking about the left hand, let it do its thing because you've already practiced it, and just think about the right hand and having that consistent, even sound. So, as I was just doing, I was only focusing on my right hand, and honestly, I think it sounded better than when I was focusing on my left hand. But of course, you know, when you're practicing it, focus on your left hand. Just shift your focus sometimes. Okay, and that's just it for this video. We went over double stops today. I kind of told you guys what helps me the most and how I slowly break it down and tune these intervals. I don't just painfully go one note at a time. It's very important to listen to them together. Obviously start with them separately, but hearing them together you can really hear for that extra ring. And those tips, you know, don't forget them. Sometimes shift your focus to your right hand, focus on hearing the bass line, tuning very slowly. Practicing one line at a time really helps, as well as just isolating those shifts. So yeah, I really hope that you learned something from this video and that you enjoyed it, and be sure to take this very slowly. I cannot stress that enough. So thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.